How many are we expecting today?
So we had around 125 people RSVP.
Oh.
And we have now 53, 54, 52. Yeah, people are joining by the second. So might kick it off. Right, so hello and welcome everybody to our inaugural LEANZ lunchtime webinar. My name is Diego Villalobos. I think I know most of you, but this time we have a lot of new names joining us. So welcome to all that haven't been to a LEANZ webinar or seminar before. I'll be your host today. So if anything goes wrong, you know who to blame. Right, so the panel discussion for today, it's the topic is limiting COVID's economic fallout. And as the invite explained, our speakers today are Richard Meade, Eric Crampton, and Andreas Hauser. And as I said, this is the first time we do this. So it might not run very smoothly, but we're hoping for the best here. So I'm going to say a couple of words of how we plan to run this webinar, how to run this call. So because we have a lot of people joining, we have already 64 participants. Can I please ask everyone to be on mute except for the speakers? And if we experience any troubles with bandwidth quality, maybe it's worth also turning off the videos for those that are not speaking. We are recording this presentation, but we will not record the question and answer session. And the idea is to upload the materials to the LEANZ website after the webinar. For the questions and answers session, we decided to go with the chat box feature. So if you look at the bottom of your screens, there's this button which says chat. So if you have any questions, feel free to use that feature to write your question. And then when we come to the Q&A at the end of the 3 presentations, then I will read out the questions. If there's a lot of them, I will not be able to get to all of them probably, so bear with me. For the lawyers that want CPD hours, I will explain at the end of the webinar how we're gonna do that. And in terms of the running order for the presentations, we're gonna have Richard Meade speak first for 15 minutes, then Eric for another 15, and Andreas for another 15. And we're gonna allow around 15 minutes for questions at the end. So if I'm not forgetting anything, I think that's all in terms of admin for running the call. And with that, I will hand over to Richard with the first presentation.
Very good. Thank you for that, Diego, and welcome everyone again joining us on our inaugural webinar. So I'm going to try and screen share my slides. Here we go. And hopefully you're seeing a slideshow right now. And if you're not, these slides are on the Cognitus website, so www.cognitus.co.nz. You can download them right now if you wanted to. So anyways, Diego said he would be quite tight on timing, so I'm going to kick off straight away. Pressing a button and nothing's yet happening. Okay, so I'll launch in with what I think the problem is. And obviously I'm sharing my views, not somebody else's views. You can take them or leave them. Firms and households around the world have been hit by an unprecedented correlated economic shock. And correlated is quite important, obviously. We're all getting hammered at the same time. Through no fault of their own, these businesses and households, regardless of their financial health going into COVID, pretty much all of them will be looking a bit financially sick, some a lot financially sick. And of course, it's the lockdown measures themselves, however necessary, and all the uncertainties about how COVID responses are going to evolve in the future that actually amplify this problem. So it's not the pandemic per se that is going to be harming the economy, but how we try and control the pandemic. And even if we have effective countervailing measures, and I mean measures for the economy, this will surely lead to cascading and widespread business failures, redundancies, falls in GDP, well-being, and reduced future tax takes. So there's going to be we don't come out of this without bruises and scratches, that's for sure. And as I see it, we're currently in the eye of the storm. I think it's the next quarter and the quarter after that where we'll see really the full impacts starting to express themselves. But we do have choices right now about how best to minimize the economic impacts. And this is to do with the question of how deep or how steep is the V or the U or the bathtub. Choose your recovery profile of choice. We do get to affect the shape of that. So what would be the key feature of an economic response? Let me just make sure I haven't jumped too far. Okay, so the urgent challenge, first and foremost, we have to limit any permanent impacts of the pandemic, and we could qualify that as unwanted. Maybe we want to shake some things off along the way, but we want to make sure, for example, that firms believe that they can financially get through the disruptions without having to liquidate or go into bankruptcy. And then, importantly, we need households too to believe that they can keep their heads above water. So in other words, keep their jobs, keep their incomes, keep their homes, pay for their groceries long enough for whatever normal looks like to come back. And this is really a thing that I stress more than I've seen stressed elsewhere. Each sector, so the firm sector, the household sector, they rely on the other's viability. Households need firms to be viable to give them jobs and income. Firms need households to be viable to giving them demand. And so, since each sector relies on the other's viability, neither firms nor households can sustain these beliefs that they're going to get through this unless the other sector does as well. Okay, so nobody can expect to be okay unless they believe everyone else will be okay. And this is why it's hard, I think, for any one of us to claim solvency or bankability. If we go to the bank and say, give me a loan, and they say, well, what are your prospects? I'd say, well, you got to tell me what everyone else's prospects are, to be honest, because I have to tell you what my clients are going to be doing to know what I'm going to be doing. And so this means it's critical to sustain economic confidence and, as a consequence, sustain revenues, jobs, purchasing power as much and as widely as we can, and not just in firms and households. Okay, why don't the existing support measures achieve this? Again, this is my view. I think it's because the support measures are basically too selective to widely sustain confidence. What do I mean? Well, wage subsidies, for example, will not protect jobs unless the employing firms can also continue to pay their other bills other than wages. And they can't pay those other bills if their expected revenues have collapsed and if they can't get liquidity to somehow see them through the economic shock. So, if you want to protect a job, you've got to protect the employer first. Mortgage holidays, they are viable. That's precisely because the banks offer them expecting to get full repayment later. So if you don't pay your interest now, you're going to pay interest on interest later, because that's how mortgage holidays work. So banks are fine with this. But can we do those sorts of holidays for your rent, for your utility bills, insurance, your groceries, etc., etc., supposing they could even be secured? And that puts a hit on the other parties who are providing these services. That implies, a hit that they then have to absorb themselves, and that could feed through to other economic shocks. Business lending schemes, if they've got business as usual lending criteria, if they have tight lending caps, so think of the $10,000 for small businesses, for example, or short repayment horizons. So if you take out an overdraft, you've got to pay it back in 90 days, etc. These things are precisely the sorts of mechanisms that won't be able to prop up businesses in the short term, because who can promise that they'll be liquid in 90 days' time? We can't. So if you're applying business as usual lending criteria, there's a very good chance you can't satisfy it. And that means that the banks who apply these criteria won't be giving you any short-term liquidity to see you through the shock. Tax refunds for loss-making businesses, well, that's all fine. If you are a loss-making business, you get some cash back. But what if you're a business whose revenues have simply collapsed? So you're making a low profit, not a negative profit. You don't get anything back on that. Okay. And the real punchline for all of these sorts of measures, and so I haven't been exhaustive, but the thing about these measures is they are selective. You can't assume that other people have access to them. So nobody can assume these measures are keeping everyone else afloat. And so I can't assume that these measures are keeping my clients afloat. So I can't assume that that's going to keep me afloat. And so that's the fundamental problem with these measures being quite selective. They pick out individual cost lines, right? They're not really focusing on the big picture, which is if you have a good revenue line, you can pay all your costs. And then to make matters worse, we're deficit funding these things. They're quite expensive. And that might not just be ineffective, because I don't think they do what I think needs to be done, but they are actually costly charges against future generations. So there's a real equity issue here as well. And that's why the government has to think very hard about both the affordability and the equity aspects of deficit funding any sort of COVID measures. So what do I propose as a solution? Well, without delay, and ideally this would have been before lockdown, government should commit to making low-cost loans available to all businesses and households, call them non-major ones, so leave New Zealand to look after itself because it's big enough to, for example. And these are the businesses and households that don't already enjoy insured incomes. So, excuse me, my mother receives superannuation. That hasn't gone down with COVID. So my mum's income is fine. She's able to pay her bills. It's other people like small business owners and households that are losing their jobs that'll be worrying more about their ability to get through this. And other features, for as long and as often as is needed due to the pandemic. Of course, that's open to interpretation and needs definition. And a key feature of what I'm proposing is that the loans that you get would be proportional to your COVID-related revenue shortfalls. So if you lose a quarter or a half a year of revenue due to COVID, you can borrow a quarter or a half a year of your revenue, whatever that happens to be. So it's a form of ex-post income insurance. And it shouldn't be lost on you that, as it wasn't on me, if you're a higher income earner, you pay quite a lot of tax. Precisely the moment when you need some insurance out of the social security system, you discover that welfare benefits in New Zealand are quite meagre. So they're not going to do you very many favours. Another key feature, this would be interest-free until the economy recovers sufficiently, and that's another matter of interpretation and definition. But importantly, you repay these loans once you get through the difficulties through higher taxes if you take out the loan. So you're voluntarily going to take on higher personal taxes if you take out one of these loans. So it looks a bit like the student loan scheme. And it also then gives effectively the government a form of equity in your business or your household, because you're saying as your prospects improve, a slice of the improvement's going to the government to repay the loan. For businesses, you tie these loans to the shareholders so they just can't liquidate to avoid repayments. And it would be a charge against estates in the case of personal borrowers in case they die before repaying. Okay, and this is a subtle point, this last one, and it's actually taken me a couple months to really fully flesh out the intuition that I relied on when I came up with this. I think businesses need to pay some proportion of employees' wages. Why is this? Just very briefly, and I'd need to take more time to explain it, is to avoid a prisoner's dilemma. If businesses all shed their low-income, easy-to-replace workers, hold on to their costly key workers, for example, then that means that the low-income workers would end up having to disproportionately borrow against their own future incomes. There's an equity issue there, but actually it's a prisoner's dilemma for businesses, because if all low-income workers get laid off by businesses, a big chunk of demand is then lost to businesses. So you need a focal point for businesses to coordinate on to avoid the prisoner's dilemma. Okay, I would see these loans as being more cost-effective, more affordable, and more intergenerationally equitable than direct dollar-for-dollar support measures like wage subsidies. Really, because here the government's only subsidising interest, and you might say some default risk as well. And because these are much cheaper to offer, it means you can offer them more widely and longer. And the real problem, of course, is the wage subsidy scheme is going to run out pretty soon, and that's going to present a cliff to many businesses. And administratively, you could call this as a fairly simple sort of scheme because IRD already runs something like it, the student loan scheme. And IRD already knows what your pre-COVID revenue is, so that's pretty easy to verify. Okay, now ideally these sorts of loans would have been committed to before any lockdowns. Why is that? Because I think they will be much more effective as a preventative than as a palliative. You want these things to be announced in advance so people know that everybody else has a lifeline, so none of us needs to worry that anybody else has a lifeline. If you wait for the redundancies and the business closures to set in and use the loans as a palliative, then you're going to have to be covering bigger revenue shortfalls. The point is, if you announce this early and it sustains confidence, you don't get so many revenue shortfalls, you don't need to take out the loans. Okay, importantly, these sorts of loans take away government-imposed qualifying criteria in the government's favoured cost lines, which obviously is wages in this case, and instead it substitutes self-selection criteria and self-prioritize cost lines. You pick which cost lines are super important to you and you look after those. The self-selection criteria means that these sorts of loans are incentive compatible, because if you take out a loan, you're choosing to pay higher taxes. Other people might not be, they don't pay higher taxes. It's you who will pay the higher taxes, and that protects against over borrowing. And as it happens, I think that's probably the lesser evil in this sort of world anyways. We want the liquidity to keep flowing. And they otherwise rely on households using their private information to determine how much income insurance they actually need to pay their priority bills. We might decide to stop paying some of our bills, but at least we can pay our priority ones and we know what they are. If this scheme were to be implemented, you'd be choosing that yourself. So you'd be able to keep your house, etc. You'd be able to pay your priority bills, and that obviates the need for the government's bluntly targeted subsidies. So rather than picking winners like wages for some workers, you get to choose what you pay, and you don't need to have mortgage holidays, etc., etc.
Richard, this is your couple of minutes warning, yeah?
Okay, thanks. Yep, I've got 3 on my clock, but I'll take your lead. So they fill important gaps. They enable all households, not just low-income ones, to smooth their lifetime consumption in the face of the COVID shock. That's a real kind of economic sort of idea, smoothing consumption over life. One of the problems is anti-slavery laws means banks don't let us borrow against our own future. They can't mortgage us like they mortgage our house. And so in this particular exceptional pandemic situation, there's an exceptional role for government to step in and help with some liquidity. And you might have noticed that our usual income insurance is meager, even for low-income applicants. It's wholly inadequate for anyone who's vaguely skilled. $490 a week, how much of your mortgage do you pay with that sort of level of subsidy? Let's suppose we don't do this. Well, as far as I can tell, and I have been looking very hard for months now, there's nothing else already in place, let alone on the horizon, that adequately preserves whatever economic confidence remains. So I think confidence would continue to hemorrhage. The wage subsidy's already been wound back and will soon run out of road. So really you could say it's delayed the inevitable for many businesses, and it's been quite a costly delaying of the inevitable. There's a dollar for dollar subsidy. And of course, once you lose confidence, very hard to restore. Think of a flywheel, and confidence is the momentum in that flywheel. Once that wheel starts losing momentum, it's really hard to get it going again. This means business failures, redundancies will continue to spread, and exponentially, like a virus, you might say, and that's going to lead to reduced future tax revenues. And as I said at the outset, I think it's the next quarter or two where we're really going to see this thing shaking out. And of course, the longer the borders stay closed, the more it's going to keep shaking out. And so, if we do have a reduced future tax take, that could require cutbacks in future health and other social services, a bit like Britain did after the GFC. And there's been a Lancet study that said about 130,000 British people died prematurely as a consequence of austerity in the UK. Pro rata population based, that would imply about 10,000 deaths in New Zealand if we have to do the same sort of strong cutbacks. So by fighting COVID, we are saving lives now. That's important, but we are losing some lives later because Pharmac has already started announcing cutbacks of certain pharmaceuticals like Keytruda. So some people are going to be dying as a consequence of the cutbacks, and that'll be worse if tax takes fall. And we're also placing costs on future generations through deficit funding. It's essential that we acknowledge the trade-off. We're trading lives now versus lives later. To say we're trading the lives versus dollars is actually immaterial. We care about well-being, and dollars are just the means to well-being. We also need to minimize the trade-off, make sure we've got an efficient one, not an inefficient one. And then, of course, we need to make sure we've got the right balance ultimately. So that's me. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Richard. So now we're going to go on to our next presentation from Eric. So if everyone can hold on to their questions, feel free to start typing them down on the chat box. Otherwise, you can type them later. So yeah, Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Richard. I enjoyed Richard's presentation. It was fun. Going into lockdown, we'd been working on a policy position paper of the range of economic responses that the government should be considering going into the pandemic. It went beyond some of the economics, but also was talking about some of the health response that needed to be scaled up. And one of the things that we'd pitched at that point, this was again pre-lockdown, was an extension of the student loan scheme to non-students as a way of helping people to engage in that kind of income smoothing that Richard talked about. We would have had it to a lower overall cap, but we think that it's still a pretty reasonable way of trying to deal with this. There are established mechanisms for getting those kinds of things paid back. I think that the Ministry for Social Development was a little bit worried about the administrative burden. It's them that has to administer it rather than IRD. And they worried about extending it from a few tens of thousands of students to potentially everybody. And IRD, I think, was a bit worried about enforcing payback on it. But it's still an idea that has some potential to it. But I'll skip over now to the bits that I was mainly wanting to talk about instead. As we see it, there's a fair bit of important work to do. Let me get these slides moving. All right. So for limiting the damage, we have to be able to scale up public health capabilities so that we are able to be more economically open. You can probably see things like lockdowns and level 2 status alerts as being kind of substitutes for an adequate public health response. If we look abroad to countries like Taiwan, they've been able to manage all of this without lockdowns because they have enough contact tracing in place and rigorous testing regimes to make sure that if 1 or 2 cases popped up somewhere, it can be stomped down on really hard and really fast. So scaling up some of these public health capabilities will allow a lot more economic activity. It would also make it a lot easier to reopen the border in safe ways. It can be done safely. We think it's critically important. I'll get into that. And then finally, we argue that maintaining fiscal prudence also really matters. We agree with Richard that the government taking on some debt to deal with this. Of course, that's the reason that you maintain fiscal capacity during normal times. That's the whole point of the Public Finance Act, right? That you maintain debt at prudent levels all the time so that when something like this hits, you can take on the debt that's necessary to deal with it. But being able to take on the debt that's necessary to deal with it requires fiscal prudence in every other area that isn't related to the pandemic. So normal responses to these kinds of things, if you look back at the Christchurch earthquakes, for example, it's not just taking on debt. It's also some reallocation of spending priorities within existing spend. Some spending just is less effective than it used to be and might be much lower priority. So for example, it seems odd that we're still engaging in international tourism promotion when we are forbidding tourists from coming here to visit us. You might wonder why we're spending money on that right now. There could be similar funding lines that could be reallocated towards COVID response rather than taking on more debt to deal with it. And we can also think about ways of changing the government's sort of net asset position rather than taking on additional debt. And the New Zealand Super Fund could potentially come in there as well. So we'll go through these. Now, just for how bleak things are looking, this is coming out of Massey University's GDP Live dashboard, where they do some forecasting of what GDP is going to look like out of as close to real-time data as they're able to get their hands on. GDP data is quarterly and always comes out with a couple months lag. It's always too late. The government has not been able to get its minds around more real-time data. It would seem obvious that they could be using PAYE data to give us a sense of what's going on. They're not doing it yet. But the Massey dashboard isn't too bad. Now, the only reason that this region has come in as pink rather than red is because my mouse hovered over it when I was taking the screen grab. Oops, it's red everywhere. We're looking at a massive cut to GDP that's across the whole country, and it's affecting basically every sector other than construction and electricity, gas, water, and waste services. Electricity use is actually up a little bit. I guess everybody with their home offices are leaving their heat pumps turned on where they would have left them off when they'd gone into work otherwise. But everything else is just a bleak, horrible mess. So we're looking at some problems ahead. Now that on a regional level, it is across the board. If we look at the actual public health risks at a regional basis, it's a much different picture. So this was a map that was done by Newsroom. So they were doing some fantastic reporting through all of this. They've stopped recently because everything's gotten a little bit too boring with the daily runs tally looking a lot more like a really good spate of bowling and test cricket rather than COVID numbers like that we were familiar with from earlier in April. These are the numbers from May 15. And at that point, it had been at least 4 weeks since the last case of COVID in all of these district health boards, right? And 4 weeks kind of matters because that's 2 full cycles, 1, 2 of incubation periods, right? So if anybody had it and passed it on to somebody else and then passed it, if you look at a place like Southland, that would have been like 2 weeks ago, right? Or sorry, 4 weeks ago. And that was as of 15 May. It's now 12 days later, and the only tiny number of cases that we've had since then, it's like 3 cases, they're all up in Waitemata in Auckland, right? They're all affiliated with that one cluster. They have nothing to do with anything going on down the South Island. So you start wondering, why is the whole country on level 2, right? It would seem pretty obvious that Southland could be on level 1, West Coast could be on level 1, Canterbury should probably be on level 1 as well, right? You could turn the whole South Island onto level 1 and keep level 2 for the places that have still had cases popping up, or where it's been less than 28 days since the last case. It seems ridiculous to me that the whole country is still on level 2. When I'd asked people about it earlier, they'd said, well, you know, there's still some travel between regions and you can bring it from one region to another. We're hitting case numbers now that if we haven't scaled up the contact tracing ability to be able to deal with what little tiny bits are left, like God help us, right? So we should be able to open up a little bit more broadly than we have. Now, the government has said that it's taking a very cautious approach in keeping all the economic activity down, but there are many ways of taking a cautious approach. Scaling up contact tracing is a far better way of implementing a cautious approach, because you're not, you're not shutting down the whole economy and killing jobs, right? You can do this. Oops, I have managed to get rid of my slideshow. And I will bring it right back. Apologies. I'll just keep talking while I find it. So there are lots of ways of doing this. The scaling up in contact tracing ability is critically important, not just for being able to re-enable economic activity domestically, but also for starting to think about reopening the border. And there we are back, and I should go back to sharing it. There we are, we're still screen sharing. Excellent, I apologize for that. Now, we can reopen safely. And we've got good examples abroad. This was a tweet that came from Laurel Chor earlier from her trip back to Hong Kong. She's a Hong Kong resident, and she's coming home from Paris via London. On arrival in Hong Kong, they were all temperature checked, of course, then kept very separate from each other, filled in all of their quarantine details of where they were going to be. They got an electronic bracelet that would track where they were. It was keyed to their cell phone so that it was always going to be transmitting. And they went into a hall and waited 8 hours for their COVID test results to come back. If you combine this kind of a testing regime with a fortnight's real quarantine where it's monitored with things like bracelets, or in secure facilities like a dorm that's really monitored, like a security guard making sure that people are knocking to go out to the bathroom in individual units, and then there's sanitation afterwards. If you have a really strict regime like that, that's also cautious. You don't have to have the border entirely closed. Now, we wouldn't be getting the same kind of tourist numbers that we're used to under that kind of regime, because who would come here for, say, a 2 or 3 week holiday for spending 2 weeks of it in quarantine? But international students obviously could start coming back under these kinds of very safe arrangements under a user pays system. Everywhere else, we're talking about, like, how can we possibly get back to something like that's a 3/4 of normal, or maybe 80% of normal, like you dream of getting to 90% of normal. But in international education, you could go to 200% of normal, right? New Zealand has been kind of mid-cab on the rank for international students, where, well, maybe if you're not quite good enough to get into Harvard or Stanford and you're looking at other places, New Zealand might start hitting your radar if you kind of like the country, or maybe you're in a place where your parents don't want to fess up to that you went to sort of a mid-tier kind of place and nobody knows where New Zealand ranks. We've done well in that kind of a market. Right now, we're the only game going for a real normal university or tertiary ed experience. We could be pulling in all of the students who would be looking at August semester entry in the United States at really good schools and bringing them here instead. Like right now, the Reserve Bank says that international ed contributes 1.1% of GDP by value add. If these guys were coming in, they wouldn't be heading home for the summer break. You don't want to have to go through 2 weeks of quarantine again. They'd be touring the country. They'd be filling up the hospitality venues that are currently abandoned, right? We'd have opportunities for growth instead of decline. And I don't know what's holding us back. We could open the border tomorrow to that. The universities are ready to put up their own facilities at their own cost, because when international students are paying 25 grand a pop for tuition as compared to the 7 or 8K that domestic students pay, you can put them up in a luxury hotel room for a couple of weeks, right? Give them room service. It's not hard. Everybody is chomping to do this through a user-pays system, and the government is just so terrified of letting anything happen and of wanting to direct the recovery in all of their little favored ways. We're getting into some pretty terrifying economic space if that's the attitude. And critically important too, I think, is that this is be done on a fairly neutral basis. So instead of it being, well, if you're an international student, you're allowed to, but not if you're going to do this other thing, the criteria should be whether you're able to come in safely. If you're able to come in and can show that you've got a space in a quarantine facility that's been approved, you should be able to come in, and it shouldn't matter whether you're a student or whether you're filming the next horrible Avatar sequel, or whether maybe you're part of an international sporting code that's decided to, instead of throw away $1 billion European television contract, to start opening a New Zealand, Australia season and play their games here and televise them back to Europe to keep their revenues on the television side, right? We have no clue what industries might want to move here, temporarily at least. Maybe we can encourage them to stay for longer, for a COVID-free experience. Like Facebook has talked about their workers being able to work remotely. Some of them could come here instead of being stuck in COVID-ridden hellholes, right? They'd be getting paid by Facebook. They'd be spending their money here. They'd be making links into the local tech sector. We've got so many opportunities, and we're just throwing them away while bailing everything else out and making make-work schemes. Instead of having make-work schemes, why not set up a reserve army of contact tracers? Train them up, have them ready to come into service if anything happens, but otherwise, that's something useful, right? It enables so much more economic activity. And instead, we're just trying to mitigate decline. It's terrible. So beyond that, fiscal prudence and microeconomic sensibility, those still really, really matter. No disagreement with taking on debt in principle, but some of the debt that they've taken on doesn't really make much sense. I don't know why they've bundled increased pay for ECE teachers so long as they've got an appropriate set of qualifications to get 100% of the teachers at ECE being fully qualified as an ECE teacher. Like, I remember when I had my kids in ECE at Canterbury University and they were talking about shifting to 100% qualified, and I was railing against it as a parent, saying, I don't need the person who's washing the bottles and helping with the diapers to have a qualification to do that. They know what they're doing already, right? It doesn't help me any. It doesn't help more broadly, right? There's spending lines that should have been reallocated that instead are seeing increases in spending, and it's unrelated to COVID. That makes it harder to get the path back to fiscal prudence at the end of it. And the government is supposed to be projecting a path back to fiscal prudence. In budget lockup, when I asked Minister Robertson about this, because the furthest out that they forecast in the budget was 2031, and at that point they were seeing us hitting 42% debt to GDP ratios. So I just wanted to know whether he was seeing that as being the new normal for fiscal prudence, or whether there was a continued path back down to 20% that was beyond that forecast range. And he just wouldn't answer the question. He got really kind of shitty about it. Well, I believe I'm behaving fiscally prudent. Well, yeah, I agree. It's prudent to take on debt to deal with a horrible Great Depression style calamity. But knowing what the path out is kind of matters, and what the time horizon for it is, and what they see as being prudent debt levels, because the bipartisan consensus for the past couple of decades has been get it down to around 20% of GDP. And we have potential for, well, we've had a couple of recent little earthquakes. The big one is still yet coming someday. We'll have to have capacity to take that debt on again. And we're throwing some of that away when we're locking in spending line items on things unrelated to the pandemic response. Paying it all back.
This is your couple of minutes warning. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's all good. I'm on my last 30 seconds anyway.
Cool.
Paying it all back. We have to not be breaking everything else. And you start hearing just really scary sounding things coming out of the ministries and out of the ministers on those fronts. So when Shane Jones floated a proposal to ban all log exports, like, that just sounded strictly insane, right? You've got an export industry that's still working, like logs are getting piled up in Chinese ports at the time, but why would you ban exports in trying to build up some idea of your view of what the logging industry should look like and value-added domestic manufacturing stuff? It's just madness, right? And the scheme that they have put in is only slightly less mad. Bans on overseas investment. At times when firms need access to capital more than ever to be able to finance some of the messes that they're dealing with, and debt can be tough to get when it's harder to project what your fiscal path is looking like for all of the reasons that Richard was talking about. Equity stakes make more sense for a lot of these guys because then they can at least share in the upside. But if you're banning the people who have capital from investing in the last COVID-free place around by reducing the overseas investment threshold, when we already had, I think it was the fourth most restrictive regime in the whole of the OECD, it's absolutely bonkers. We need instead to be looking at measures that make it easier for firms to adjust, not harder. Things like how Vodafone was able to shift retail staff into call center workers working with web support for their clients. Imagine if we had gotten into some of the pay agreements that have these award setups with strict role definitions and strict pay awards, like Australia has and Labor has been pushing towards. You get rid of that kind of flexibility, right? So the government's agenda has been pushing us towards things that reduce flexibility at times that we need it even more strongly for dealing with this very real shock. So there are lots of opportunities, but we're risking blowing them. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. And thank you for the questions that have been posed. We have a couple of questions already. So if I can encourage Eric and Richard to have a look for the Q&A session. And in the meantime, we're going to go over to Andreas. Andreas, the floor is yours. I think you're on mute, Andreas.
Right, I'm trying to unmute and share at the same time. I think I've achieved both. So
yeah, you have. Thanks.
Thanks, Diego. Thanks, guys. Look, my talk today is going to focus on New Zealand's COVID lockdown and how it caused an economic shock that damaged firms' balance sheets. And that could lead to a credit crunch and a disorderly failure of a large number of firms. So just give you an overview of my talk. So we'll talk about the systemic shock so that businesses went through so that wider society could realize the benefits of elimination of COVID. Talk about then how the shock hit balance sheets and how this could lead to a credit crunch and disorderly business failures. We'll then look at international comparisons of how other countries have dealt with SME finance packages and point out that New Zealand is somewhat of an anomaly with its limited support. And then finally talk about implications for New Zealand's business support package. So it's really quite nice that I've been able to follow Eric and Richard. So it's broadly sort of consistent with the message, I think. So moving on. So as we all know, normal life ceased on the 23rd of March. During the 7 weeks of lockdown, firms in all industries suffered a significant drop in income, as the Reserve Bank analysis on the screen shows. And life's slowly returning to normal. I mean, it's not quite normal. I'm sitting here in an empty boardroom and I can't enjoy and look forward to what would normally happen at a LEANZ seminar. I get to have some refreshments and a nice chat with you all afterwards. But in all seriousness, you know, we've got this lockdown that's been extremely successful in eliminating the disease, as Eric has pointed out. And the go hard, go early strategy has been successful, but it's also been more restrictive on lives and livelihoods than in other countries. And you know, the jury is out on whether the hard and fast strategy is less costly in the long term than an extended and less restrictive regime which allowed more firms and workers to carry on. So just taking an example of Australia, our kind of closest comparator, the evidence there suggests their less restrictive policies might have produced similar epidemiological results. You know, they've got a longer tail of, you know, 2-3 infections a day being reported in the States, but similar results, and they achieved that by keeping their important manufacturing, mining, and construction sectors going largely. So my point is here that many New Zealand firms have endured an unprecedented supply shock during levels 4 and 3. And as that shifted into levels 3 and 2, we endured a demand shock. So workers haven't yet fully returned to the CBD. Wellington's a pretty empty town still. Tourists obviously are completely absent. And there's, as Richard's been pointing out, the confidence factor is so important. Wider economic uncertainty is lowering the willingness of households to spend. And the impact of all of this on firms' balance sheets is serious. Almost all firms, supermarkets accepted, there are some firms that have come out okay, but almost all firms will have suffered a deterioration in their equity. Firstly, many firms continue to incur costs even as their revenue stopped. There are offsets, the wage subsidy scheme being one of them, but that doesn't cover fixed costs. Secondly, social distancing rules and consumers' behavioural change has reduced the productive capacity of many firms. And thirdly, firms also need to make significant investments now to meet the COVID-safe requirements, or just to adjust to the new trading conditions. For example, since entire markets are now shut off, they need to reorient themselves. These investments will enable firms to continue to operate, but won't produce any returns. So the systemic nature of this shock changes the lending ability of banks. So this is less to do with the cost of credit, but more about the risk appetite of lenders. With a widespread deterioration of balance sheets, lenders either need to reduce the amount of lending and the scope of firms that they're lending to, or lower their risk thresholds for the lending criteria. But banks are limited in how far they're willing to lower the risk thresholds. The Reserve Bank has given some relief with changes to funding ratios, but any further lowering of risk thresholds at banks is unlikely. Banks simply will not want to assume a higher risk of borrower default when the defaults are, as Richard's also pointed out, highly correlated. And I just want to point out this phenomena is unlike the GFC. In the GFC, the banking system suffered a liquidity crisis, and even firms with healthy balance sheets face problems accessing finance. In this COVID crisis, most firms have suffered a deterioration in balance sheet health, and even a liquid banking system applying conventional lending criteria is unlikely to support those firms. That leads me to the sort of final point, which is that as firms fail, the capital base of the banking system takes a hit, and that leads to further tightening of credit conditions. Banks get more risk averse just at the point in time when you need to take on more risk, and borrowers need a greater willingness from banks to lend. So we think this will quickly have an impact on the real economy. And as widespread firm failures occur, insolvency proceedings are likely to be disorderly. In normal conditions, an insolvency is designed to ensure that weak balance sheets don't undermine productive capacity. So if a firm has excessive debt and is unable to access any more liquidity, but the underlying assets are economically valuable, normal receivership ensures that the business survives despite the losses suffered by the current equity holders. So the usual process is that the assets of the failed firm are purchased by investors, employees are rehired, and business restarts. But if this is a widespread event, and a series of business failures is occurring without access to additional liquidity, that's more disruptive, and an orderly recovery is more difficult. You could probably see firms with simple business models and few employees being able to resolve relatively quickly, but more complex businesses with complex assets that are more knowledge or skills intensive, they will take longer to restart with new owners. So yeah, a widespread correlated downturn. There are high financial and time costs of business insolvency, and the costs of liquidation are magnified, and if that happens on a widespread scale, it will be disorderly. So what have other countries done to support businesses with liquidity? So governments have broadly tried to balance the desire to help firms with an equally strong desire to avoid financing firms that are going to fail anyway. And so we've reviewed international schemes and found that effective solutions broadly have four features: the prompt and efficient administration. There's a clear transfer of risk to the government, either in full or significant part. The credit has a subordinated quality, and so that's, for example, interest-free periods or discretionary forgiveness, and there are support of wider policy settings. So just looking at prompt and efficient administration, that generally means that the support is dispersed quickly on the basis of simple and quickly verifiable criteria, and that's without the detailed due diligence and credit analysis that a bank would undertake. So internationally, where there have been timeliness issues, governments have quickly responded to introduce new schemes. I think so. The German and the UK schemes are examples of that. There needs to be a clear transfer of risk for the scheme to be broadly judged a success, we think. So the Switzerland and the US, there's been a lot of criticism with the scope of that and the ease with which you can access it in the US, but broadly, that prompt, quick transfer of risk has been important. And the US has probably gone further than anywhere else. I mean, the Federal Reserve there is directly monetizing debt of medium-sized firms. So not suggesting at all that New Zealand should take that path, but that's just to illustrate what some countries are doing with this liquidity issue. And then the subordination of liabilities. Most countries are looking at this as a long-term debt. It's treated separately to normal lending from commercial lenders. And if this is to be an effective liquidity bridge, facilities must not weigh too much on firms' balance sheets and hinder future recapitalisation. And these schemes are all accompanied, like in New Zealand, with complementary policy. So short-time work schemes in Europe. Some countries have wage subsidies and allowances. So the lessons for New Zealand, I think it's pretty clear that the first iteration of our SME guarantee scheme has not worked very well. It doesn't lower the credit risk of borrowers. The banks are still required to carry out their normal lending criteria, and so they're exposed to 20% of the debt, and they take that additional risk exposure very seriously. So looking at the Bankers Association website this morning, only $60 million has been dispersed to 376 firms. The cash flow scheme announced later is, I think, an acknowledgement that the SME guarantee scheme wasn't working so well, but that's very modest. So it's only $10,000 plus $1,800 per employee, and only applies to small firms. And so the graph on the right there shows there are a significant number of firms that aren't eligible for that. So, conclusion, many other countries are engaging in this cash flow support for businesses. New Zealand appears to have been an outlier. We imposed costs on firms during the very strict lockdown. As I said, over the longer term, whether that strategy was the right one or not will be revealed. But the COVID and the policy response to COVID has consequences for firm balance sheets and could lead to a liquidity crunch. And if that crunch occurs, the current policies probably won't prevent that large-scale insolvency event that I mentioned. So that's it from me.
Thank you very much, Andreas. So that concludes the presentations, and we go now into the Q&A session. We have about 10 minutes left on the hour, but we have this Zoom facility until later. So if people want to stay past noon, you're welcome to stay if the conversation lasts that long. So what I'm going to do now is stop the recording and go into the Q&A session.